Back in 2015, we recorded a disc of music by Jonathan Harvey. That was a very ambitious project for us, and I suppose it marked the culmination of 6 or 7 years of immersing ourselves in that great music. After that was complete, I started thinking about possible other projects which might follow that in a long-term way. I've always greatly admired choral conductors like Martin Neary and the late Stephen Cleobury, people who were extremely adventurous in commissioning music by mainstream classical composers, not just by the sorts of people who specialise in choral music. And after a lot of thinking, the person I decided to approach was Michael Finnissy, undoubtedly one of the greatest British composers of our day, and I was fortunate to have got to know Michael a little bit a couple of years before, when he wrote a wonderful carol for our Advent carol service. Our college has its roots around 1200 in the St John's Infirmary, and here in First Court you can still see the outline of the original chapel from that period. But the college itself was founded in the early 16th century, and you see the buildings of that period also here around us in First Court. And since that time, of course, many other buildings have been added over the succeeding 5 centuries or so. So when I approached Michael, my original conception was to try to mirror the architectural layering of the college in musical terms. So my proposal was for him to write 4 new choral motets, each of them based on a 16th century motet, like First Court, and each of those motets had in turn been based on a plain song melody from some hundreds of years earlier, a bit like the Infirmary.
In a way, I think people don't know that much about how those composers felt about what they were doing. So it was good to sort of take it apart and think how this might have been assembled, why that architecture rather than this architecture, how does it reflect the time it was written, and so on and so forth. And how did it reflect the text? Having sketched it, having told him what I was doing, there were no secrets. I disclosed every moment of anxiety and pleasure and happiness and whatever, a whole mixture of things. I did start to diverge after the first anthem.
When Michael was going to embark on the third choral piece, he said to me, look, instead of taking a 16th century motet as the model, please, this time can I use a 6-movement Bach cantata as the model instead? And perhaps Michael may have been influenced in that by the fact that we sing these termly cantata even songs liturgically in chapel. It's also interesting that he wanted to take an 18th century model. Standing here in First Court, if you look at the southern range of First Court, that was all remodelled in the 18th century, some 20 years or so after Bach died. And then for the fourth choral piece, Michael perhaps surprised me even more.
I would like to make a homage to Michael Tippett, who wrote the choir such a splendid original setting of the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis. And I knew that the choir also had the Plebs Angelica, the only other piece of sacred music that Tippett wrote. And I said, well, I'd like to write the Plebs Angelica, because by that time I had seen the 4 anthems as a kind of sequence. Dum Transiset begins with the women coming to the tomb after the crucifixion, and Jesus is not there, apparently, when they first get there. So it starts from this extraordinary emptiness, which is then gradually filled with a kind of on and off life story. And the idea of a journey from one stage to another is also part of this cycle of pieces. So it made sense to finish with another look at the moment of dying when the soul is transported by angels.
And at another stage, Michael said, well, look, 4 choral pieces, that's not very much, is it, for a residency? Why don't I write 5 organ pieces to go with them?
Because I heard Glen Dempsey play at the service, and I thought, this is too good an opportunity to miss. So I ventured to say to Andrew, can we have commentaries, organ commentaries, on each one of the anthems?
It was a fascinating process collaborating with Michael over 3 years and seeing the cycle develop. I remember when I first played his first organ piece, the double Ondum Transiset, I was a little bit perplexed when he asked me if I could just change 1 or 2 of the chords in it. But then 2 years later, it all became clear when other pieces emerged, and you could hear these sound worlds unifying the whole cycle.
And then he said, well, you don't just want organ, how about having some other instruments as well? And you could imagine the conversations.
I just saw the possibility of creating a, for me, more celebratory work than just the 4 anthems, and it grew like topsy.
The more time you spend with this music, the greater the range of beauties that you find in it, and all the allusions and cross-references.
I do try and make a rich texture, a diverse texture, in the hope that people will explore. It is music, of course, that can be just experienced once, but I've found myself in listening to music that once is very rarely enough. I want to come back later. Later might be the next minute, the next day, the next year, in 10 years' time. And I'm finding different things. I'm perceiving differently. I
think this is perhaps another parallel with some of the greatest modern architecture. Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao is a great example of this. You can go to that building and approach it from different directions, approach the outside of the building from different directions, and it has a completely different character depending on which angle you're viewing it from. And yet the building is so tightly integrated through the use of motifs and colours and textures and materials and this kind of curves, etc. I think that's a good parallel with this Finnissy work. Just every time you come back to it, you see new beauties in the music, and that's a wonderful thing.
I want people to have permission to think when they listen to music. And one splendid thing about working with St. John's Choir is that even the small boys were incredibly intelligent and sensitive and curious about what it was they were singing and what I was asking them to do. They didn't have a problem with assembling all these things into one space in their head. It was quite moving to talk to them about their, just the thrill of singing discords and the thrill of singing from one end of the tonal spectrum to another. They were excited by it.
The net result is this extraordinary sequence of 9 works. I think it probably totals nearly 85 minutes in duration, but it's a sequence of extraordinary variety, and yet it all forms an amazing organic whole. So I really think this is a true masterpiece.